May 20, 2025. Michigan City, Indiana. Benjamin Ritchie, a 45-year-old man with documented brain damage, a brain doctor who said functioned like a child's, was carried out for execution by the state of Indiana. His jury had never heard a single word about his condition. The governor had already said no. The parole board had already said no. The Supreme Court had already said no. Benjamin Ritchie was strapped to a gurney inside a chamber. No journalist was allowed to enter and no camera was allowed to film. While outside those prison walls, people stood with candles and prayed for a man the state had already decided was out of time. His last words were not rage, not bitterness, just 6 sentences about love. And what happened to his body inside that chamber after the drugs began flowing is something the state of Indiana has never fully explained. Benjamin Ritchie had been on death row since 2002 for a crime that took place on the night of September 29, 2000 in Beech Grove, Indiana. He was 20 years old when he shot and killed Officer William Toney, a 31-year-old law enforcement officer who had pursued him on foot after a stolen van chase. Ritchie fired 4 shots. Toney did not survive. At his clemency hearing just weeks before his execution, Ritchie himself described that night as a train pulling out of a station with no brakes. And for the first time publicly admitted he had intentionally pulled the trigger. He said, "Several bad decisions led to the death of a man who would still be alive today if I had not committed this horrible act." That admission did not save him. Nothing did. And so, 25 years after that night in Beech Grove, the final hours of Benjamin Ritchie's life arrived. Not in a courtroom, not in a hearing room, but in the dark outside a prison in Michigan City, where the people who still believed the system had gotten something wrong gathered one last time. As the sun set on May 19, 2025, outside the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, a prayer vigil was already gathering. Members of the Catholic Diocese of Gary stood in the prison parking lot with candles, calling for mercy in the hours before midnight brought what the courts had scheduled. Media were not permitted inside. Journalists who had traveled to cover one of the most contested executions in Indiana's recent history were told they could stand in the parking lot, nothing more. Indiana is one of only 2 states in the country that bars media witnesses from executions, and on the night of May 19th, that policy meant the final hours of Benjamin Ritchie's life would pass largely in the dark, away from any independent eyes that could tell the public what they saw. Inside those walls, Benjamin Ritchie spent what his attorneys described as his final days reconnecting with the people who loved him and discovering the impact he had made during his years incarcerated. His record on death row was complicated, more than 40 conduct violations over 2 decades, some serious. But beside that, he had built real connections, earned the praise of some corrections officers, and in the final stretch of his life, arrived at a place of steadiness that people around him noticed. His attorney said he faced the end not with rage, but with a composure that was difficult to reconcile with what the state was preparing to do to him. And what the state was about to do is where this story gets heavier than almost anything you have heard before, because the argument his legal team was still making, even in those final hours, was not just about mercy. It was about something the jury that sentenced him to death had never been allowed to hear. And once you understand what they were never told, the weight of May 20th shifts in a way that does not shift back. Benjamin Ritchie had been on death row since 2002, more than 20 years, before anyone ran the full medical evaluation that revealed he had partial fetal alcohol syndrome. His mother drank alcohol almost every day during her pregnancy. She also used marijuana and other drugs. The brain damage that resulted was not about poor choices or a weak character. It was structural, biological, present before he ever drew his first breath. Forensic psychologist Dr. Megan Carter testified before the parole board that Ritchie's condition made him more like a child psychologically and socially than a functioning adult at the time of the crime. Her exact words, "Individuals like Mr. Ritchie are working with brain damage and not just poor decision-making." A geneticist went further, saying his functioning was comparable to someone with an intellectual disability. The jury that sentenced him to death heard none of it. His attorney stated plainly that Ritchie was condemned without that evidence ever reaching the courtroom, and that a different verdict would very likely have followed had it been presented. Authorities maintained the conviction had been properly reviewed, and the legal standard for halting the execution had not been met. The parole board considered the diagnosis, reviewed his history of childhood abuse and neglect, and still recommended proceeding. The governor agreed, but here is what makes the final day of Benjamin Ritchie's life impossible to look away from. At his clemency hearing just weeks before his execution, he stood up and said something about the night of the crime that no one had ever heard him say publicly before. And the words he used to describe it will stay with you. On May 5, 2025, at his clemency hearing inside the Indiana State Prison, Benjamin Ritchie stood in front of the parole board and did something that stopped the room. He took full ownership, no deflection, no new theory, no claim of innocence. He described that night in Beech Grove as something that could not be undone, and said he had carried the weight of Officer Tony's death every single day since. The room held that. His legal team held that. And then in the same breath, they went back to arguing that a brain-damaged man who functioned like a child at the time of the crime should not be executed by a state whose jury never knew the full truth of who he was. Both things existed at the same time, the admission and the argument, and neither one canceled out the other. And so May 20th arrived. The candles outside the prison burned through the night. The journalists stood in the parking lot with no access and no answers. And inside, the clock moved toward the moment that had been written on the calendar for weeks. What happened in that chamber and what his attorney saw through the glass is the detail about this execution that the state of Indiana has never fully explained. Shortly after midnight on May 20th, 2025, the Indiana Department of Correction began the lethal injection process. Benjamin Ritchie was given a single drug, pentobarbital, from a source the state declined to name publicly. His attorney, Steve Schutte, stood on the other side of the viewing glass as a witness. A few minutes after the blinds opened, he watched something he was not prepared for. Ritchie's head and shoulders came up abruptly from the gurney. A sudden, sharp movement that Schutte later described to reporters as appearing violent. He could not hear whether Ritchie made any sound, could not see if his eyes were open, could not read the reactions of anyone else in the chamber. "I have no idea what any of that means," Schutte said immediately after. "There may be nothing. I couldn't sense that he was in any pain. I think it may have just been a muscle reaction, but I don't know." Because no independent media witness was in that room, no journalist saw what Schutte saw. No one outside the official witness list can say with certainty what those movements meant or what Benjamin Ritchie experienced in those moments. The blinds closed at 12:51 a.m. Witnesses left at 12:53 a.m. He was pronounced dead at 12:46 a.m. on May 20th, 2025, 45 years old. His final meal was the tour of Italy from Olive Garden, and his final words, the last thing Benjamin Ritchie ever said to the world, were not what most people expected from a man who had spent 23 years on death row, a man who had fought through courts and clemency boards and a diagnosis that came decades too late. What he said was so quiet, so human, that it made the silence that followed feel even heavier. Benjamin Ritchie's last words were, "I love my family, my friends, and all the support I've gotten. I hope they all find peace." That was it. No declaration of injustice, no final argument for the cameras, no bitterness about 23 years of waiting. Just love and a wish for the people he was leaving behind. For a man whose legal team had spent years arguing that his brain damage should have changed everything, and who had weeks earlier stood up and admitted publicly to one of the worst things a person can do, those final words carried a weight that does not fit into any clean category. They were the words of someone who had arrived somewhere his supporters had not, and could not follow him to. His lead attorney, Catherine Koselka, released a statement immediately after. Benjamin Ritchie spent his final days reconnecting with those who love him and discovering the positive impact he had on many people's lives. Tonight was the result of prioritizing finality over fairness. She continued, "We continue to believe, as did half of the Indiana Supreme Court, that Ben's execution was inappropriate. Indiana executed a man with profound brain damage and developmental disabilities." That last point, that half of the Indiana Supreme Court itself had questioned whether this execution should move forward, is not a small detail. It is the kind of fact that does not disappear when the official record closes. Outside the prison in the early hours of May 20th, the people who had gathered with candles the night before slowly walked away into the dark. The bell that echoed outside the Indiana State Prison after an execution rang out, a sound that had now marked 2 executions in Indiana within 6 months after 15 years of none. The machinery, once restarted, does not slow down easily. The next scheduled execution in Indiana was already on the calendar before the sun came up. Benjamin Ritchie left behind people who loved him, family, friends, attorneys who had fought through every door the system had to offer. He left behind a medical diagnosis the jury that sentenced him to death never heard. He left behind an attorney standing in a parking lot at 1 a.m. trying to describe a sudden movement on a gurney to reporters who had not been allowed to see it themselves. And he left behind 6 final words that the people in that room are still carrying. Whether Indiana made the right call, whether the courts were correct to say the FASD evidence came too late, whether the process treated him fairly, those questions will follow this case for a long time. What cannot be argued is what the morning of May 20th looked like for the people who were there. A man with a brain damaged before birth, sentenced by a jury that did not know it, carried out for execution in a room the public was never allowed to see. The day that had no tomorrow arrived exactly when it was scheduled to. And the only ones who know what happened behind that glass are the ones who were in the room.